Hello. The Dayton Africana Elders Council, nation builders and warriors, come to you today in recognition and celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King has been described as being a social activist and a Baptist minister who played a vital role in America's civil rights movement in the 1960s. We are honoring Dr. King's legacy and the lasting imprint he has left in the world. One of the beliefs of the Dayton Africana Elders Council is in order to create a strong village, we must identify areas of weakness, prioritize, and plan accordingly. Our nation builders and warriors have identified critical priority areas that consist of the following: physically and emotional well-being, economic power, political awareness, and culturally rooted education. Today, we will focus on African-centered education with an emphasis on culturally rooted education. We will begin today's discourse with a libation led by Baba Bing Davis and Audrey. Baba Davis.
Thank you. All important gatherings of African-centered people should and could start with a libation to those who've gone before. So in the pouring of libation of water of wine to the earth is a way of remembering and commemorating the ancestors on whose shoulders we stand. So we start with going back to the first people, African people, the first civilizations. And we want to give thanks for all of those great civilizations that have evolved out of the continent of Africa, our motherland. And we say, Ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe. Ashe.
We want to remember always the skills, the abilities, the intellect, the creativity that embodied the minds and spirits of African people. And we say, Ashe.
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 We want to remember always and commemorate and be proud of the great kingdoms that were built, the great buildings that were built, the knowledge of working with iron and gold and silver, brass, the carving of wood, the weaving of cloth, and the decorating of the human body itself. And we say Ashe.
Ashe.
We want to always remember the multitude of Africans that were captured and turned into slaves, but who were crafted, were weavers, doctors, educators, city planners, village planners, and we say Ashe.
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 We want to never forget the multitude of ancestors who's on the ships heading for the new world, who did not make it to land, whose bones lay at the body of the oceans today. And we never forget them, and we say Ashe.
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 We want to remember always the multitude of ancestors who we could trace back from ourselves to them. And we say Ashe.
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 We want to never forget the multitude of African peoples in the New World, in the Caribbean, in North and South America, and particularly those on the shores of what we call the United States. And we want to remember them always and say Ashe.
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 And thank them for their struggle, for their continual struggle from the first day of land until they deceased. We want to never forget all the work they've done to prepare us for today, and we say Ashe.
Ashe.
We want to never forget the multitude who experienced slavery and Jim Crow and the building of this country, our immediate ancestors that we can call and say Ashe.
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 We want to thank them for their strength, in the Great Migration to transport African descent people all over the United States and the world. And we say Ashe.
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 One forget and remember always those who lend their souls, their bodies, their mind, their spirit, their intellect, and their creativity in the struggle for freedom. And we say Ashe.
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 We want to never forget those great leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we say Ashe.
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 And we give honor and commemoration to the multitude of young warriors and nation builders who agreed to pick up the baton and help us move to the next level of existence towards freedom in this country. And we say Ashe.
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 Thank you, Dr. Baba Bing Davis and Audrey. We thank you. Today, we are presenting in the format of a panel. At this time, we ask each of our panel representatives to introduce themselves.
Audrey Davis and Bing Davis.
Olabisi Olakolade of the Dayton Africana Elders Council.
Dr. Venita Kelley.
Just doing that.
That's what I'm saying.
Prince Simeon Oyeyemi.
Dr. Umvikeli G. Scott Jones.
And I am Vondia Jackson Thompson, also a representative or a member of the Dayton Elders Council. We will begin with this question. What does culturally rooted education mean to you? Dr.
Well, I'll jump right in there.
Mm-hmm.
Culturally rooted education for an African person, an African born in Africa or in the diaspora, but let's say here in the United States, means that we relate to our African culture. And that means that it's an African-centered form of education because the culture that we descend from is the African culture. We've had such a problem as research has shown. A lot of the research-based, one of the most important research-based issues is the fact that our African students or students in America who are of African descent don't do well academically or socially when they're disconnected or decentered from their cultural heritage. When they're uprooted and have no concept of what their culture is, it makes it a situation in which when people sit down for cultural sharing, our children are the ones that don't have anything to share. And this is just such a sad situation, and it's caused by our educational system because it presents our children a truncated racial history. It starts in slavery rather than in the great civilizations of Africa. We've had to struggle over the past decades to even get the great civilizations acknowledged as African. So many of our children don't even know that those were African civilizations. How can we get them connected back to their culture? How can they see their greatness? They learn a lot about slavery, which is 400 years, but the thousands of years of high culture is what defines us. not the 400 years of slavery.
Thank you.
Molefi Asante, in his book, The Afrocentric Idea, talked about how it is that Black people in the United States in particular, but particularly all over the diaspora, wherever they have been, have had to, since enslavement and coming through the Middle Passage, have had to dance between circles and lines. And for him, that's symbolic of the circles of a collectivist people, where we come from, and the lines of a linear people who have therefore enslaved us and or oppressed us, and who also then have some power over how we are living in the modern day. But as Sister Olabisi has talked about, when we start talking about world philosophies and what a culturally rooted education system means, we, as Baba Bing said in his libation, are talking about the ways that African people have been situated around the world and have then evolved into peoples who have different world philosophies. We could go all the way back to people like Tedla, as he talked about African thought, what we call African philosophy, and how it is that that philosophy then shapes how we live in the world. I'm with Sister Olabisi in this, is that our children are not taught to know that philosophical thought. I do believe that it comes through us culturally, but there's no way to often name it. And without naming something, it often moves around in the ether, and children don't understand, and it has been attacked so that they don't know that they can claim it in order to be able to move through the world. In a culturally rooted education system, our young people would be able to learn who they are at the very center of who they are as African rooted people. And then they would actually learn the different iterations of rootedness culturally around the country, and therefore would never ever feel like they were less than someone else, especially because really, truly, they can actually connect to being from those who were the first thinkers and educated in the world.
Thank
What
you.
I believe culturally rooted education is more related to the African diaspora as a whole. The reason why I don't just say African centered, that limits us to the African continent. In my studies, I've come to realize that our culture is more than just the continent of Africa, because previously to the 400 years of slavery, at the period of time right before then, our culture ruled in Japan and India. You know, we ruled the world. So when I say culturally based, that's the way that I approach my arts in my business life and my personal life, with the understanding that culturally rooted education would include the emperors of Japan, the samurai Yasuke, who was a black samurai who was actually studying my family history, was from Nigeria and was taken and hidden during slavery time. That's why they thought he was a slave. He wasn't actually a full out slave. He was being a royalty that was taken over. So I have a different understanding just because of my family history. So that's some of the things that guide culturally rooted for me. And as far as in the Dayton public and Dayton area, that's what I try to teach. Because even culturally rooted for me is graffiti culture as an artist, something that I've been involved in since 1983 when I was born and lived in New York and the Bronx through up until 89. So, you know, the hip hop culture is culturally rooted for me differently than it would be for someone else.
I'm so glad that you explained that, because some of the things that you're saying are kind of exactly what I was referring to. People don't know that Bodhidharma was African. People don't know that India was Indus Kush. You know,
Yes.
these people don't know that Indians that are, you know, indigenous people who are called Indians are not from India. These are the
Yes.
kind of cultural lies. And the lie is always given to conceal the African lineage and the African identity in culture and civilization.
And
So
real
until we
quickly,
take the
to sort of put it
Yeah.
into a real fast perspective, what we're missing is that, okay, laws were changed when Europe enslaved the world. Laws were changed so that religion ruled everything and the crown ruled the religion. So when they did that, they made it so that when they talk about how the first slaves here were indentured servants, those were the rich Africans that they rounded up from Europe as the slave ships came around the coast, as they enslaved everybody. That's why the Africans that came around South Africa, those initial people were going as indentured servants, and they were the rich Africans from Europe who were tricked out of their land and their rights. So that's what got the families from India as they went past, Japan, all the indigenous people became outlawed in their lands, as we all know. So it was basically the Black people of Japan, the Black people of India were the ones who were brought to the Americas initially as indentured slaves because they tricked the royal blood out of the rights and made because as royalty, Europe changed the law so that the head of the household, if the head of the household was considered a criminal, everyone under the head of the household was considered a criminal. So all you had to do was take the royal person in the family and say, you're a criminal. Now, every domain that you have is now criminal domain. That means in England, Europe, India, they just took one bloodline and said, here, got him. Essentially. Yeah.
Thank you, Brother Simeon. Would anyone else like to contribute to the question?
I'd like to go ahead next. Wow, this is, first off, I'm just happy to be part of this panel because I just love listening. But so basically, when we're thinking about culturally rooted education, so my work is as a band director in Dayton Public Schools and as an adjunct instructor at Central State University. Plus, I give private lessons and I perform as a musician and compose and create visual art from time to time. But most of my work is that of teaching. And I just want to refer actually back to a lesson I was working on this week. One of the things we've been doing in Dayton Public Schools over the past 5 years is, I think it's been 5 years, is rebuilding band programs, basically from scratch. Unfortunately, due to circumstances that were before I started working in Dayton Public Schools, we've lost over basically about a decade we've lost of students participating in serious instrumental and vocal music. And so we're literally building this culture from scratch. And so the work that I was doing this past week in a completely remote lesson was connecting marching band, actually historically Black college and university marching band culture to some of its African roots. And our students don't have a clue. So for me growing up in Pontiac, Michigan, which is near Detroit, it's a suburb of Detroit, and you know, I was exposed in junior high to the idea of going to college and to going to universities on a music scholarship or on something. It was my junior high band director who said, you're either going to Michigan or Michigan State. It was Michigan, Michigan State. I don't know why, but it was just those two schools. And I ended up doing my master's degree at the University of Michigan. And then my high school band director was constantly talking about historically Black colleges and universities. And he took us to Central State University for homecoming. Our drum majors went to Hampton University for their drum major camp. And he exposed us to this culture. So I got all these different perspectives. And then when it came time for college, I had to figure out where I was going. And I attended Central State University for my bachelor's and my master's at Michigan and my doctorate at West Virginia. My point is just that I had this culture growing up. I had teachers who, music teachers who didn't say, we're going to get Black or we're going to talk about African rooted or culturally whatever, but it was just what they did. Not that it's not important, but they just, that's what their flow was. That was their zone, was basing everything in culture. And I grew up in a musical culture that unfortunately our students in Dayton Public Schools didn't get for over a decade. And so where we are right now is building that culture from scratch. And so for me to then talk this week about historically Black college bands, my students know Central State is down the street, but they have no idea that when the ladies are dancing in front of a band, that's reminiscent, that's directly connected to dancing in all over the continent of Africa, as well as all over the world. You know, they may know that it's a Black thing or it's a Black college thing, but they don't have the understanding necessarily of, oh, this is ancient, that we're carrying on this ancient tradition. the idea of doing back bends or different dance routines or this, that, and the other, different types of rhythm, that is connected. And, you know, goes back, not only, it does go back to the continent of Africa. And it's not just that it happened 500-600 years ago, that it's happening today. That that the music, you know, the first time I went to South Africa, I was in this place that was like Walmart, and I heard Snoop Dogg on the radio, and I'm like, I came all the way to South Africa to hear Snoop. Great, that's awesome. But the point is that we're part of this global world, and our students, a lot of the students that I work with, they just don't have that connection. And so that's what I take and try to infuse it this week. Just to wrap this comment up, we also spent in this lesson, we spent a little bit of time with the Sankofa bird. I just kind of put it in the top left corner of this PowerPoint or the slideshow, and I said, has anybody ever seen this? What direction is the bird facing? Where is it moving? What's that in its you know, its beak? And they get the connections. And then if we talk about libation in the classroom, which we did also, they understand the idea of pouring out a liquid. They understand it, but they don't understand, as it's already been said on this panel, that it's so connected to something that's ancient, and that is a tradition beyond just where we are here in the United States.
If I might add, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
If I might add, and I had planned to only listen, but what we were questioning at the beginning, we're touching upon the value of what we're doing. The arts and culture is so reflective of our culture. It's at the root of this.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that the philosophy, the concepts of beauty are rooted in the rites of passage. Birth, puberty, marriage, death, and after death, and transmitted through ceremonies and rituals, which involve music, dance, visual and decorative, all the arts. And so our particular African-centered culture is necessary to understand that connection that we're talking about. But what had happened, that with the enslavement of people, the first thing you have to do is take away their culture and then their language. And usually it's the language and then the culture, because that's where our philosophy and our concept are already embedded. So when you take that away, then you go right back to the point of showing a doll to a kid that they're going to select the white doll, because they've been destroyed and negated away from themselves. So our hesitance to begin today as a language was rooted in that, even though we're together. So I understood. So the more we can look at the African-centered culture, the easier we're going to be able to understand and appreciate that. The other aspect of that, that's 1854, there was a division of the Chocolate Cape where all the European powers met at Berlin, and they sat around the table. So instead of fighting among themselves, they decided who was going to control what part of Africa. So that's when you go to Congo, you're going to hear German is the primary language, and there's 7 French languages. There's 8 English language, and so those colonizers controlled everything first by taking away language and then taking away culture, because then you can control people. And so I was really fascinated to hear. And if you go back to the beginning, we now know all the slave routes and how many people were taken to all parts of the world. Not to mention that we were not only the first people, but we populated the world. So it's not surprising to find Africans in China or Japan, or any place where you find people, because we were the first. We were the first. And so what it is about is how can we get back to sharing that and learning and teaching from it. When we're trained artistically at these universities, including myself, we start with 1 or 2 caves, because in a cave you can, the climate allows things to last. And so we looked at the Lascaux cave in southern France to start European art history or Western art aesthetic, or Altamira cave in southern Spain, and that's where you start to study culture through the art that was there. They didn't tell us that you and I know from Senegal all the way to East Africa, there's a thing called the Sahara Desert. That was not always so. Underneath the Sahara Desert, in Tassili in Algeria, there's a cave that outlasts, is older than the two caves where Europe starts to study culture, Altamira and Lascaux. Tassili in Algeria is even older. So when we got in there, we began to see our history, our culture, and our whole aspect of it, but that's not a part of how we're trained. That's not a part of how we're trained. So I, for myself, in discovering this, in 1966, I said, I stopped teaching art and I began to teach people. But I taught from an African center. White students, the Black students, they're gonna get an African-centered education if they're gonna be in my presence and do it. So I'm just pleased and oh yeah, the truth. Just dealing with the truth and the fact, it's obvious. Getting back to what we have to do and how we have to teach. Once we do, we're going to end up with nation builders and warriors on every block, just like you guys.
And
Baba Bing.
may I add on to that?
Thank you, Baba. I present to you another question, a quote, in fact, attributed to Dr. King, and it goes as follows. Perhaps the most important function of education, according to Dr. King, is to fight against the ignorance and misinformation. Ignorance and misinformation, period. Okay.
Yeah.
In your opinion, are our schools living up to Dr. King's idea of education, fighting against the ignorance and the misinformation?
I'd like to address that with a quote from Dr. King. And it says, at this point, I often wonder whether education is fulfilling its purpose. A great majority of the so-called educated people do not think logically nor scientifically. Even the press, the classroom, the platform, and the pulpit in many instances do not give us objective and unbiased truth. Dr. King made that statement when he was a teenager.
Wow.
He was already a student at Morehouse College.
That statement still stands now.
Oh, yes. Yes, I have to agree. These issues are so critical for us today. Baba Bing brought up so many of them, the self-esteem of our young people, being ashamed to be referred to as African.
Something he hit on the head was that he said that they took away the language first. What I was speaking of on how they tricked the Africans out of the land, starting with Europe first, was they tricked them through language. A lot of people don't understand that Shakespeare was a historian. He wasn't just a poet. He was telling real life stories by using some fictional names, but then most of the time he did historic names. And if you listen to the play, I think it's Henry IV or Henry VIII, the one that, seventh, the one that contains Jack Falstaff in the story. That story is telling of how the king or the prince tricked the Africans who didn't speak the language out, but they believed in the faith of Christianity. That's how he tricked them into falling under indentured servitude. So in the play, Shakespeare even writes in stuff like, I walked into the room and the dark fellow spoke in the funny language, blah, 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 blah. So he writes in Shakespeare in the play, blah, 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 trying to imitate an African language. When you listen to they talk about how all the Africans had to take on European names like Nigerians. My name is Simeon Olawrewaju Oyeyemi. So Nigerians give Christian first names, African middle names, and your African last name. So it tells that type of story in Shakespeare's writing, how they were getting Christian names, didn't speak the language, the prince could understand the African language and the American language, so he tricked them out of through guys, you know, to make them submit to the new ruler, who was the king and the spiritual leader as well. He was basically the Pope as well. So that's how they did that, you know, by not teaching, sort of by someone not knowing the language is how they won it. You understand?
But another example of the Euro-centered educational system. It's just another example. And if we can bring it back to the education of our youth, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to address that problem that, you know, we've all seen, we've all experienced it? Along with that problem, we see the low self-esteem. Along with that problem, we see the elementary school to prison pipeline. We see that we're so disconnected from our culture, and our culture is always the leading culture globally. When in 1972, I was a student at the University of Madrid. When I was in a department store, they were playing James Brown's "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud" over their PA system in the store. Our music is appreciated and leads culture all around the world. Hip hop is the most moneyed music in the world
the
right
money
now.
maker.
But that money is not coming to us. Okay. We are, everything that comes from our culture is demonized, denigrated. You gave a good example of it, but the question is, how do we address it now?
And that leads
And part
into
of it is,
question.
may I
That
jump
leads
in?
into the next question. The next question is exactly what you said. What are you doing to preserve the belief that our children deserve better and to ensure that they are receiving the level of education they just deserve? What are you doing?
I need to go back. I will answer your question by saying I developed an ecosystem for education, a concept strategy map that can be addressed, and I've been working to get it across the country from people who are working in education all the way down to the local. But I want to go back to the other question because I go, when those things, because the ignorance and misinformation that we talk about, the education is not living up to the ideal because we have not yet held the educators responsible for learning our history. At one particular time, I'm working with Dayton Public Schools, and though we have a very good approach to talk about our students reading Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, we did not also require the teachers to have read that and be able to speak about that. And therefore, to put it in the hands of the children without, the children, fine, we can educate them at the informal level. In fact, 70% of what we learn and what is learned by most people is at the informal level. So we can actually take control of the learning that we give to our children in our communities, especially if we will, as you say, with the Saturday school, work together to do it. But if there are people who are teaching our children in the formal education system, and for us to not ask for them to understand and know these concepts come out of a people who are learned in the education system, then we give that away. A few years ago, because I ran a program for the state of Ohio that was about the fact that our children were being underserved in the state of Ohio. 68% of African-American males were not graduating high school in the state of Ohio at that time. It was the chancellor for the state who was going to mandate that that teachers, all of the schools of education in the state, were going to have to do at least a multicultural system and curriculum. And with that curriculum, there would have been people who would have taught them the curriculum that they were in fact going to put into place across all the education schools, so that when they moved out of the education school into any public school system, they would carry this idea of an African-centered, a Latino-centered, or et cetera. In our cases, we're talking African-centered. They would know enough about it to be able to bring that information in themselves. Until we start to put it in until we start to hold them to the line of, you will in fact bring this information into the learning of my children as an educator, we will still have this problem.
Yeah.
That actually happened.
Dayton Public Schools.
What you're talking about was part of the was after the No Child Left Behind program. That was a part that a lot of people don't understand was injected in there. See, at that time, I was the substitute teacher. I was on the substitute teacher reserve board, as well as substitute teaching. And that stems back into what Scott was talking about as why it doesn't happen in the Dayton Public Schools. Because when that, the law that Dr. Kelley was talking about was passed, is when the levy failed. So when the levy failed, all the programming for the music and the arts was chopped in half. All of the sports programs were cut in half, and most of them still haven't come back, like baseball, wrestling. They only kept the major sports. They switched it so that we only had one art teacher to cover maybe 3 or 4 schools at a time. So we were rotating like once a day, you may see 2 schools. That's when I was at Wilbur Wright at the time doing a long-term sub. So they basically made it so that everybody had to disperse what they were teaching. You know, they chopped jobs, which caused the culturally aware stuff to be left behind.
Well, I wanted to share this with the audience, is that at one point, Dayton Public School did have an Afrocentric curriculum. Okay, this textbook was the book that was used to teach about African American history, and it all came about as a result of some of our community activists going down to the Board of Education and primarily demanding that there be curriculum focusing on African American culture. And eventually it didn't last very long, but maybe I agree with you, Dr. Kelley, it's time for us to begin reintroducing the African American curriculum within our schools.
Great.
And that's just a comment.
We sincerely want that to happen. Then we've got to look at independent African-centered educational programs, because these initiatives that so many people have tried to introduce into the school systems, and this is not just a Dayton story. This is a Washington, D.C. story. This is a Portland story. This is a story all over this country that has a systemically racist school system. So what do you do in that case? You cannot change it from the inside. Changes that have been made, even when they were temporary, happen because of actions and movements of people on the outside. Even right now, the movements from the Black Lives Matter movements that have caused people to now use systemic racism as a buzzword opens up some space for us to talk about the systemic racism in the school system. We have to keep pushing it. It's not gonna last, if it's not happening on the outside as well as the inside. I directed an independent African-centered school in Florida for 40 years. And we found, and I was also hired by the school system to do workshops, how to bring culture into the curriculum. And I did workshops for teachers and train the trainers. And a lot of times the teachers would say, yeah, we believe this information and this is good information, but we might get fired if we teach this in our classroom.
Right.
Actually teach that Columbus wasn't a hero. No, and that Columbus was the originator of slavery in the United States of America before it became the United States of America.
And the whites don't teach themselves that.
Yeah, we have to have so I'm saying we need a 2-pronged attack. We need the people in the inside working with the people on the outside to make sure that this is a sustained initiative. Because I think any initiative that you've ever seen, you see how it just petered out and now it doesn't even exist anymore. So the Saturday school is a way, because we know that most of our students are in the school system. That's where they are. But if we could have them on Saturdays and we can give them a kind of cultural grounding so that they will not be being ashamed of their facial characteristics or their complexion or their hair texture, that they can have a healthy self-esteem instead of this racist dysmorphia. We have to work together. In Florida, we worked with the teachers who were sympathetic in the school system, and we worked with the people in the community. That's the only way we could just keep things going and keep things going. And I have to say that we have now thousands of students that came out of that process that are now attorneys, doctors, politicians, traveled all over the world. They're artists, dancers. They're just doing everything. And not only are they just doing everything, but they're using their skills for their community as opposed to just making money. So
Okay.
I just think we have to look at that. I just had to get that in there.
I'd like to jump in on this one, if that's all right. As far as just going back to the question of what are you doing to preserve the belief? So one of the things that myself being, once again, on the inside of the classroom, and basically what we are as educators, I think not just in Dayton public schools, but really in the Dayton region, and we're being forced to look at culturally responsive education. We're being forced to look at trauma-informed education and different things like that. And I think that there's so much truth to the fact that people coming out of these college programs and education programs at the college university level, they're not prepared. I've had colleagues, actually, even as band directors, coming out that just don't feel like not just they don't feel like it, but they can see the evidence that they weren't properly prepared to teach, to come into the classroom and manage a classroom and to educate. And then when you have young people who are basically looking to you for stability, coming in as a teacher, you have to represent the stability in the room. You have to be the person who's going to give a concept of what we're doing to move forward, understanding. Also, you have to be students are looking for so much. And so if you're not being prepared just period as an educator, then we have these problems of students not learning regardless of what the curriculum is. But what I'm saying is that we also, so while we have these problems that are happening systemically, we do have gems happening here and there. We do have teachers, I can just say once again, because I'm in Dayton, we do have teachers in Dayton public schools who are making these efforts and finding these ways, but it's very difficult sometimes, I believe, when you're a teacher, because you have this curriculum, you have to teach this book, but you also have to figure out how you're going to get these other things in here that are actually relevant to students. One of the big catchwords or catchphrases is relevance and rigor. And so making something that's relevant for students, and then also making sure that it's rigorous and pushes them forward and advances them. But when you have this curriculum that may be completely disconnected from students that you're forced to teach, then you have to redesign curriculum altogether. So I think that also goes back to this, what you were saying, Mama Olabisi, about people being afraid to teach something because they're afraid of losing their jobs. And I'm not saying I'm afraid of losing my job from that, but I'm just saying that there's this huge issue on the inside where you do have, but you do have, I guess I want to acknowledge that we do have people, I think probably in most districts, but I can most speak about Dayton Public, we do have people who are working on this. It's not an uphill battle, but it is a serious battle to make it happen, even with your own schools and within your own classrooms.
Can that be a priority? Baba Bean?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something very, very positive, is that being able to observe the warriors and the nation builders, I've seen what needs to be happening all over. I'm very impressed with the potential, the skills and abilities these last couple of weeks with Kawan's presentations and now hearing you guys speak. It is very positive. What we can do, hopefully, is give you the nurturing support to continue to do what you're doing. There's so many skills and abilities, and I see a lot of people doing things that are not aware of each other. but luckily the nation builders and warriors were there. But there's people like you guys in almost every school system and every community. We just need to get together and support it. And us older folk who just proud of you, just need to find ways to support, be a resource for you, or either to nurture you or support you any way we can. But you're on the right track. You're on the right track, and it's just what we need. And you can make a big difference in Dayton and Miami Valley region just by continuing to do what you do and use us where you can.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we've
can I chime in just one on that question, on that subject? Now Scott and I went to school at Central State as well. I don't know if anybody knew that. But while he was, went to further his education, I began teaching. I didn't go and further my education at the time. And thinking outside the box is where I'm working right now while he's inside the box. So it goes back to what Mama Olabisi was saying. During COVID, I helped start a program with Marlon Shackelford called Neighborhood Kids, where we began teaching art initially to doing home visits. And we would set up a red tent outside with picnic tables, had the kids have masks so that everything was COVID compliant. We ended up turning that into a 501c3 now, which is completely STEAM. So we have the science, the education, the math. We also do health and wellness, art. And and art, but we do meditation. So we have other areas that we incorporated into it during the winter time because we initially started during the summer. So now it looks like the program is going to be getting even bigger. And some people like in Indianapolis and other places, Columbus, have been looking at the model that we created and looking at trying to implement that into their systems. Because something that I learned during that time that chimes with what Scott was saying is that I was teaching drawing and painting initially, but to be culturally relevant with the kids, I ended up teaching them how to make paper airplanes and keychain bracelets. You see, I didn't necessarily dumb down my education. I just realized that kids in this generation, elementary school, there's things that they never learned, like never learned how to make a paper plane. When I was a kid, every kid knew how to make a paper plane. That's how we got in trouble in school. Making paper footballs, like they didn't know how to make paper footballs. I showed them how to play paper footballs. It's little things that my generation, I'm a Generation Xer, not even a millennial. The things that my generation learned that we did to be rebellious are things that these kids haven't even learned, but they're basics, like basics on folding paper and how to write your name, because these kids lost cursive writing. They only learn print and can barely do that now. So when I try to implement culturally aware, I even try to, my kids, they all learn cursive writing, their name in cursive this summer. If they didn't know it, regardless of how old they were, because that's something that you should know as culture.
Yeah, they should know that their ancestors were the first ones to write.
Right, they don't learn that.
No, they don't learn that.
And there are so many other things that are critical for our young people to learn within the school setting, as well as outside of the school setting, in reference to who they are. Are there any final thoughts? And if you have any, please sum them up in a minute or less.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's so encouraging to be a part of this panel. Brilliant people. It's very encouraging. As an elder, you look at the youth, the warriors, the nation builders, they're our real social security. They're the ones that are really going to bring the traditions forward. When I listen to Scott talk about, teachers coming in who don't have a cultural grounding, so they can't teach what they don't have. Well, the same thing applies to parents, because a lot of parents, they haven't been taught, so it's hard.
Parents are our first teachers.
Yeah, they're our first teachers, correct? So it's hard for them. But I just feel like listening to you all that we're up for this struggle. You know, I just feel like we're up for this struggle, that we understand that our young people are suffering, and we're committed to develop all the different and myriad types of educational programs that we need to have for them, and that we will work together, whether we're in the school system or out of the school system. I was on the faculty at Florida A&M University for 7 years, and I worked with the community and with educational programs on the campus. So I know that we can cross-pollinate, and
Right.
you know, we can support each other where we stand.
Yes.
Because look at it now, you got a gym here and there and a whole system that's systemically racist.
Yeah.
We won't be able to claim any easy victories. We really
Right.
have a struggle in front of us, but I feel like we're up for it and that we're going to prevail.
Right.
Dr. Kelley?
I think that we're in a moment where we know that it was said, it prophesied that the first would be first, the first would be last, but the first would be first again. And I think that we're in the trajectory of the first being first again, but also with the knowledge of our mistakes, as well as the mistakes that have been perpetrated, mistakes, huge soul-searing mistakes that have been perpetrated against us. I always like to give people someplace else to go look for information. So I'm going to mention Frank Hale's work. I'm going to mention David Imhotep's work, in particular, the first Americans were Africans, his 60,000 year history, with art in there, with the thought, with the philosophy, that wonderful book that David Imhotep did. Runoko Rashidi's work about where religion comes from. There are so many people that have been doing this work, and where parents feel out of their way. The Elders Council, Dayton Africana Elders Council, is a really strong place to go to begin to find the books that they can listen to on tape now if they're not big readers. And so that informal education that gives our children back to themselves, I will challenge that parents who are listening to go ahead and to begin to do that from the books that they give their children as children, all the way through their own work and their own self-study. Listen to it, because and you can find it on YouTube these days. So make it easy for yourself, and then pass it on to the children.
Thank you.
Dr. Scott? Do you have any final thoughts?
I have a couple of quick final thoughts. First off, I'm just very, very thankful and happy to be part of this panel. This has been an awesome experience. And I guess really trying to think about an important final thought or something else to add, because so much has been said. So my high school band director, to go back to him for a second, one of the things he always talked about was that the word education literally means pulling out of knowledge from within. And that he always said that you being, of course, our the students, have everything you need inside of you the moment you're born. And it's just a matter of pulling that out. Not to say we have all that if we just leave babies to do on their own, that they'll be fine, but that we have what we need. And that I think a lot of this work that we need to do, not just on the systemic level, but also on the individual level, is really just nurturing our own sense of self-awareness, which of course is our own sense of connection and relationship and growth. So I think that if we also, in addition to having a culturally rooted education, part of that, a culturally rooted education, an African-centered education, part of that is having a self where it's about the individual person feeling empowered to be themselves and define themselves.
With value.
Yes. Baba Bean and Audrey, do you have any last comments?
Well, I have just one. Dr. Scott reminds me of a lady who's done some outstanding work. I was wondering if you're familiar with Dr. Portia Maltsby at Indiana University.
No, I'm not.
I used to be on the circuit doing teacher workshops, and I ran across her a few years ago to Indianapolis. She's now retired, but she's been doing research in Black music. And she gave me a section, which was the calendar, of her work from beginning to 1992, where she traced every form of Black music that we created back to their African origins and all the influences, the gospel, spiritual, folk. But I'm reminded when I hear you talk about what you're doing, that's someone you should be aware of. And saw her on TV last weekend, so I don't know what she's doing, but she has a book out that is traced Black music, and it's very significant in terms of working around the country in terms of African-centered education, and her focus is on music. So I'll send my information down to you because I know you would appreciate it.
Definitely.
Thank you. 1 minute or less, please, Prince Simeon.
Okay. I guess to sum up, what I feel about culturally aware and culturally rooted education, there's going to be a change soon because there has to be, but it all stems into us realizing that we have to become the teachers for the teachers and guide them first as to what to teach our kids. And in doing that, we have to make sure that we know enough or study enough unculturally biased to be able to teach both sides and both races or all ethnicities about our culture. I can't approach a child who is Caucasian American and try to tell them about my African history if I also can't fill them in on their own history that they've been omitted from knowing. All American history says that Columbus discovered America, even though Amerigo Vespucci is who it's named after. So that means that my teachers were taught the wrong thing and their teachers were taught the wrong thing. Also that we could make European and Europe look like the biggest villain, when actually at the time, America was the biggest villain. The revolutionaries are considered revolutionaries, but actually they were European indentured servants who revolted. So we had prisoners that blinded their white kids of the truth of their atrocities, and those white kids taught Black kids and white kids nothing about African history. You see, so just to sum it up, my approach is to sort of eradicate all the misnomers and misunderstandings of, we can't always blame the white folks because the white folks don't know either. You know, the blind can't lead the blind. And that's what we've been going through for years after slavery and Jim Crow, civil rights movement, all the way up until now. Even in hip hop culture, they don't always teach the truth, but it is the mainstream understanding or the truths that are held to be self-evident that the world learns.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And I thank you to each of you. I send a hearty thank you. Thank you so much for your thoughts that you very readily shared with us. We do appreciate it. Thank you for the knowledge that you provided. I leave you with this thought. And after the completion of this thought, I would like for Dr. Kelley to please lead us in Harambe. Okay. In 1967, Dr. King spoke at a junior high school. I believe it was the Barrett Junior High School in Philadelphia. He spoke to a group of children there. And during that speech, the speech was titled Life's Blueprint. But during that speech, he left them with a challenge. And so today, I present to you that same challenge. It goes like this. Have a deep belief in your own worth. Be confident and know that you are somebody. You have worth and you have significance. Love your skin tone. Love the texture of your hair. Love you and the life that you were predestined to love. Be determined. Be determined always to achieve excellence. Don't let anyone or anything prevent you from being your best at all times. Dr. King stated, if you cannot run or if you cannot fly, you are to run. And if you cannot run, you are to walk. And if you cannot walk, you can crawl. Whatever you do, be the best that you can be, because again, I say, you are somebody.
Sure.
Hey.
As we begin, Harambe.
Harambe.
Harambe. Harambe.
Harambe.
Harambe.
Harambe.
Harambe.
Harambe.
Harambe.
Harambe.
Thank you. Thank you.